pleasure for me to be introducing our speakers today, who are here to talk with us about their participation and the broader goals of Citizens Climate Lobby. So Dr. Cliff Strawitch is a retired engineering physicist who's been active in Citizens Climate Lobby for 4 years and is the CCL liaison to Senator Chris Van Hollen's office. And Mr. Jeff Turner was director of marketing for 3 companies and the U.S. government publishing office. He's a member of the Rotary Club of Columbia Town Center, as he mentioned, and the environment of the SRAG, the Environment Sustainability Rotarian Action Group. And he has been a CCL member for 1.5 years. We've been talking about this program for many months, and it's really appropriate that finally it's come together for them to speak to us about Citizens Climate Lobby as President Bill focuses during his year on engaging youth on environmental issues. So thank you for joining us, Cliff and Jeff, and I turn the virtual microphone over to both of you.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having us. We'd like to talk to you today about a piece of legislation called the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, which we think is the best first step to addressing climate change. Jeff and I are both members of Citizens Climate Lobby. All right, I'd like to start out with a bit of a personal story here about what the heck got me involved in action on climate change. And I think it was what tipped me over the edge was a spectacular visit we took to Alaska, my wife and I, a number of years ago. We were savoring the world, as this quote from E.B. White says, in Alaska a few years ago, and we're absolutely awestruck by what we saw. And unfortunately, everywhere we went, we saw evidence of climate change and how it is changing this amazing, spectacular natural place. There's something like 200,000 glaciers in the world, and 90% of them right now are receding. And we saw quite a few of them in Alaska. In fact, I actually hiked on top of a glacier. Permafrost is melting, ocean level rises, forcing Native Americans to move their homes, change their ways of life. Animal habitats are changing. And there's also a widespread species extinction going on right now, which people think is due to climate change. So climate change is something I've resolved to do something about because I care about the natural world. And I'm a parent, so I want to do something so my kids would inherit a better world.
I'm Jeff Turner, and I've always loved the outdoors. I've always been active. I've camped my way out to the West Coast and back twice, visiting our wonderful national parks. I also was very privileged about 5 years ago to Botswana, went way back in the bush for 2 weeks, and really was impressed by the way the people there not only lived side by side with the wildlife, but they actively protect the wildlife. And around that time, maybe 5, 6 years ago, I started developing these weird health problems. It started as a sinus infection, and it just kept getting worse. And I went from doctor to doctor, and everybody agreed something's going on, but they weren't sure, and they kept passing me on to the next person. I ended up completely losing my sense of smell, completely losing my sense of taste, about 60% of my sense of hearing. And I developed a lot of respiratory problems, a lot of muscular problems, and actually ended up in the hospital twice last year. And while I was there, they figured out I have this very strange and very rare autoimmune disease called EGPA. It only affects about 1 in a million people, literally. So once they started treating me for that, suddenly my sense of smell came back, my sense of taste came back, my sense of hearing. I feel great, and I have had to go. I had 2 hospital stays and 3 rounds of chemo, but I just feel absolutely wonderful these days. And what I learned from all that was that life is short and good health is not guaranteed. So I said, well, if I'm going to give back a little bit to the world and do my small bit to try to help save the planet, I better get cracking. So I had joined Citizens Climate Lobby, and when I got sick, I kind of drifted away. So I got very active again in Citizens Climate Lobby, and I joined Rotary, and I also joined SRAG, as well as the Rotary District Board, Environmental Board. So I've gotten very active, and I'm really happy I did.
Thank you, Jeff. I think Jeff and I, at different times began looking around for ways to becoming involved and engaged about action on climate. we both found Citizens Climate Lobby, and CCL was actually founded by a gentleman named Marshall Saunders about 11 years ago. And Marshall happened to be an award-winning Rotarian. Kind of interesting. CCL is a nonpartisan organization with over 200,000 members. That number there is a little bit old. We have member representation in all 435 congressional districts, and they do a great job of empowering and training us to lobby and to outreach, and with a single focus advocacy for action, in this case, legislation to address climate change.
And as you know, environment has become a major focus now of Rotary. And Rotary past International President Ian Risley said, environmental degradation and climate change threaten us all. They are having a disproportionate impact on those who are most vulnerable, those to whom Rotary has the greatest responsibility. And other past Rotary International presidents did get together this past year and designated protecting the environment as a 7th focus area for 2021. Okay, now Rotary now has 7 focus areas, and promoting peace, fighting disease, providing clean water, saving mothers and children, supporting education, growing local economies, and now protecting the environment. And all of these are in danger from climate change. And in fact, I'm going to read you a little bit of something here from the ESRAG handbook. So this is actually Rotary talking to you, not me. And I'm just going to give you 3 examples. For example, under promoting peace, they say, ESRAG says, poor management of the environment undermines both natural and social systems. Resulting scarcities and competition for water and other national resources can increase insecurity, climate-induced migration, and refugees. And another example under fighting disease, they say the degradation of the environment, the air we breathe, the food we eat, the water we drink, and the ecosystems that sustain us is responsible for an estimated 1 in 4 deaths across the globe. And just one more example from these 7 focus areas under saving mothers and children, approximately 1.7 million children under 5 die each year from lower respiratory infections and diarrheal diseases. Cleaning up the environment reduces preventable and premature deaths. Okay. All right, so now we heard the 4-way test at the beginning of this meeting. And so if you apply the 4-way test to climate change, well, is it the truth? Yes, man-made climate change is real. And Cliff's going to show some statistics to prove that. Is it fair to all concerned? Well, actually, it's unfair to everybody. Will it build goodwill and better friendships? And will it be beneficial to all concerned if we fix it? Absolutely. It'll build goodwill and it'll benefit all human beings.
Thanks, Jeff. I always like to talk about this this particular slide because I think there's a widespread misunderstanding that there's a lack of consensus among climate scientists on the whether global warming is due to the activities of mankind or not. In actual fact, that's not true. There's been a number of studies that have looked at that. In fact, I see here that I can't count. Is actually 7 separate studies of scientific consensus. And the overall consensus is about 97% of climate scientists agree that global warming is real. It's caused by increased greenhouse gases, and human activity is causing almost all of the increase. In fact, I read a paper recently that said it's probably more like 100% now because the 3% that disagreed, they've not passed peer review and are unreproducible results. So that's kind of interesting.
And as a matter of fact, I had read somewhere that the only place where there's as much consensus about man-made climate change is the theory of gravity. That that's the only other place where scientists universally agree as much that as they do on climate change and human influence.
Interesting. Yep. So what are our local impacts? Well, certainly something we felt here in Maryland. In fact, I live about 2 miles from historic Ellicott City. Ellicott City was hit by 2 so-called 1,000-year floods in July of 2016 and May of 2018, the 2017 National Climate Assessment found that heavy rain events are increasing nationally due to climate change, with the greatest increases occurring in the Midwest, Upper Great Plains, and Northeast, which includes Maryland. On the day of the 2018 flood, the National Weather Service received a gauge report, that is a rain gauge report, of 9.7 inches that had fallen in a period of about 2 hours. And what you see is in the upper right-hand side, that's a picture of Ellicott City. You can see right down Main Street, there was a rapids flowing that was sweeping cars into the Patapsco River. It was amazing. And the lower shot shows the damages to some of the shops and the streets in Ellicott City. It was a terrible disaster. Now, there were other things that contributed to the flood. Unfortunately, there was bad planning, and there was the replacement of uphill permeable surfaces with impermeable surfaces. Ellicott City, of course, sits at the bottom of a topographic funnel, and there was bad stormwater management to keep up with development. So a number of factors contributed, but it's rather undeniable that climate change had a big impact on these 1,000-year floods in Ellicott City. This is a map of Maryland. It shows a map of District 1 in Maryland, Congressional District 1, and there's around 24,000 people that live in this district that are less than 4 feet above sea level. And for these areas, there is a 96% risk of at least one major flood taking place between today and 2015 in this area. And Dorchester County, in fact, which is already shown in blue there, is already experiencing substantial flooding. And again, there's a variety of causes. There's land sinking. Believe it or not, our land is still sinking in places, still responding to the retreat of the glaciers. But it's mostly due to ocean rise due to climate change. Here's another phenomena that's related to climate change, so-called fair weather flooding or nuisance flooding in Annapolis, rather, the capital of Maryland. So-called fair weather flooding is flooding that is not related to a storm surge or excessive rainfall, things like wind direction, high tide, of course, sea level rise, and again, land sinking push additional water towards the shore. And Annapolis experienced 63 days in 2017 that topped the NOAA threshold for coastal flooding. So that's an average of about 5 days each month. It's even worse now. A groundbreaking study estimates in 2017 that Annapolis businesses suffered anywhere between $86,000 to $172,000 in lost business due to nuisance flooding. Now, if you look at the chart underneath the picture, this shows the results of a study by the First Street Foundation and Columbia University, estimating the net loss for a 12-year period for all states due to sea level rise. And the top 13 are shown to the right, and you see that Maryland suffered something like $555 million worth of losses in the 12-year period between 2005 and 2017. Well, what about DC? Well, DC has experienced about a 2.2 Fahrenheit increase in temperature since about 1970. Now, what I'm showing here from this piece of data I'm showing here is from Climate Central, which is Princeton University's climate research organization. This is showing average summer temperatures, that includes both day and night temperatures, rising by about 2.2 degrees for Washington, D.C. So it's unquestionable that we're also warming. So what do you do about this? We certainly could cringe in our basements, I suppose, and hope it all blows over. But I know I'm talking to Rotary here, and so I think it's important we take action. Now, it turns out we have the technologies that can replace fossil fuel power generation, that is to say solar, wind, and I think nuclear actually has gotten a bad rap. We have demonstrated small-scale power storage, which is going to be necessary because, after all, the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow. But fortunately, there is a piece of legislation before Congress called the BEST Act, which is called the Best Energy Storage Technology Act, which will task the Department of Energy to demonstrate grid-scale power storage. So what we really have to do is we have to focus our attention not so much on the technology, but we have to focus on reducing emissions of greenhouse gases, mostly CO2. And there are many well-studied legislative approaches to reduce carbon emissions. And There's a lot of mythology about there that these approaches destroy jobs and destroy the economy. Nothing could be further from the truth. In actual fact, they create jobs, they improve health, and don't damage the economy. In fact, some of these approaches have already succeeded in California as well as in other countries. We only lack the political will to demand this from our government, because after all, governments don't lead, they follow their constituents' leads. And mostly they've been hearing from fossil fuel companies. So what do we do? What's the approach we take? Well, in 2019, there was a very interesting statement that was published in the Wall Street Journal called the Economist Statement on Carbon Dividends. And there were over 3,500 US economists, including 4 former chairs of the Federal Reserve, 27 Nobel laureate economists, and 15 former chairs of the Council of Economic Advisors that recommended a fee and dividend approach. And I should point out that these people were from both sides of the aisle. I think there were some that were under, what did I do with that? Here we go. There were a number of these economists served under the Bush administration. Some served under President Obama. And so there were these, the significant thing was this is a bipartisan effort.
Okay, and there's key Biden administration officials have endorsed a price on carbon. Janet Yellen said, we urge governments to take the steps necessary to transition to net zero carbon emissions. Carbon pricing is central to that. We strongly believe that every government should price emissions. And while that's not the only policy that's necessary, it is a critical tool to create the right incentives for a transition to net zero. And John Kerry, in an opinion piece on the Hill last year, said, with carbon pricing, those causing emissions pay for the cost of damage. Without carbon pricing, we all pay the cost.
Thank you, Jeff. And so the piece of legislation that we are very much in favor of is called the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. It is actually before the House of Representatives right now. It's HR 2307. And this piece of legislation does exactly what those over 3,000 economists recommended. It imposes a carbon fee on the fossil fuel companies that produce these fuels, whether it be oil or natural gas or coal, based on the amount of CO2 they will emit. It starts out at $15 per ton of emitted CO2 and increases every year by $10 per ton until emissions get below essentially 90% or 100%. What do you do with the collected money? The government doesn't keep it. This is a very key part of this thing. The government essentially gives all of the money back, equal share to adults and a half share to kids under 19 in monthly checks. Okay. Now, this is beneficial. It turns out there's about 70% of the population, of the lowest income part of the population, will actually be protected by the price increases that are expected to come from the carbon fee. After all, if you impose a carbon fee on an oil company or a gas company, they're going to pass on some of their costs. So you'll see increased energy costs, which will in fact filter down to various carbon intensive products that use a lot of electricity. So prices will go up. To protect 70% of Americans, we will provide a carbon dividend in the form of monthly checks. In addition, there's something called a carbon border adjustment. I mean, suppose a product, for example, that's produced in another country that does not have some sort of a comparable carbon price, their production costs will be lower because their energy costs will be lower. So to protect American businesses from those cheaper foreign products, for those carbon intensive products that cross the border, we would apply a carbon border adjustment. And now the European Union, it turns out, has announced that the European Union, I should say, first of all, has a carbon pricing effect already. In fact, they've had it for many years. They've just announced in January of 2023, they're going to apply a carbon border adjustment to European Union imports. And so this is potentially very interesting for the United States because it will cost us billions of dollars if we don't put a price on carbon domestically. There's also an agricultural exemption for various fuels used by farmers to protect farmers from the price increases as well. Okay, what are the advantages of energy innovation carbon dividend? Well, Supreme Court tested. What I mean by that is the Congress's ability to raise revenue by applying a fee has been affirmed by the Supreme Court, so it should be relatively immune to court challenge. In addition, it's been well studied at this point. Multiple studies from Columbia University, Stanford, Resources for the Future show CO2 reductions of 38 to 42% by 2030 if we enact it immediately. It's fast. It can work after only 9 months after the fee is implemented. One of the bad things about regulations is they can take 4 to 5 years to actually write and implement. It's fair because it protects the lowest income Americans from price increases expected from these carbon fees. We think it's crucial for this legislation to be bipartisan. So when the congressional majority changes, this legislation is not challenged. In addition, amazingly, it's popular in that 21 Fortune 500 companies, the Business Roundtable, the Commodities Future Trading Commission, I've already mentioned the 3,508 economists, 20 prominent faith groups, 123 local governments, and 839 local businesses all endorse carbon pricing. So how good is it? This is a study from the Columbia Rhodium Group that shows that if we apply energy innovation, we can see about a 38% reduction from 2005 levels by 2030. So it's effective. And by the way, this has actually been shown in practice in a number of other nations as well. Great Britain has a carbon fee in place, and it's been very effective over there. Sweden has a carbon fee in place. And of course, British Columbia has put a carbon fee on their transportation fuels, and it was proved to be very effective there. And amazingly, actually also very popular because it, rather than sending a monthly check, they actually reduced people's taxes proportionately. This is one of my favorites. A lot of critics of action on climate change say we can't do it because it'll wreck the economy. Well, this was a study that was done by Citibank, one of the largest banks in the world, looking at the cost of action on climate change and the cost of inaction. And what they found was that shifting to a low carbon economy will actually save something like $1.8 trillion. So actually, it's actually quite the opposite. If we don't act on climate change, that certainly will wreck the economy. All right, we'd like to finish with individual actions that people can take. And one of the most important, we think, is simply talking about climate change. As long as climate change remains a taboo topic, we'll never discuss it and develop solutions. For example, you can see Katharine Hayhoe's TED Talk. Katharine Hayhoe, I don't know if you're familiar with her or not, but she's the director of the climate science department, I believe, at Texas Tech, if I'm not mistaken. And she's also an evangelical Christian, which is interesting as well. You can certainly write or call your state and national representatives, asking them to support energy conservation, renewable energy, and efforts to reduce CO2 emissions, such as the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. You can join organizations working to reduce CO2 emissions, like Citizens Climate Lobby. We'd love to have you join. This adds your name and voice to their lobbying and education efforts. You can become well educated on the issue based on science, not pundits or fossil fuel companies. For example, read Merchants of Doubt by Naomi Oreskes. Naomi is a professor of history of science at Harvard University, and she's written a really revealing book about the Drought program that the fossil fuel companies waged against action on climate change. You can also sign up for something that we have in Maryland is called Neighborhood Solar. What that means is there's a large solar array that's erected at some place, and you buy a percentage of that power from the solar array. I happen to have signed up for this about a year ago. Currently, 80% of my power comes from this solar array, and the remaining 20% comes from wind power. You can also join Rotary International's new Environmental Sustainability Rotary Action Group, which I know folks in this group, especially Jeff, know a great deal about. You can consider reducing your consumption of red meat. Turns out the feeding and raising of beef emits 8 to 10% of greenhouse gas emissions worldwide, which I find astonishing. Finally, again, along the lines of getting more educated about the things you can do, you can read a book by Paul Hawken called Drawdown, which subtitle is The Most Comprehensive Plan Ever Proposed to Reverse Global Warming, for many other ideas. All right, hopefully I didn't go over the time. I thank you very much and certainly would welcome questions.
My question is, directed to Jeff, based on your visit to Botswana. In that biodiversity that you visited, which is probably Kavango, is always under threat of droughts. As much as you are lobbying, what efforts or what effort are you making in terms of making that kind of biodiversity sustainable to threats of drought in terms of groundwater recharge?
Me personally, none yet. Um, I think if we can solve the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, that'll go a long way to helping to alleviate the amount of drought that you see. I mean, that's kind of the approach that the climate lobby's taking. And quite frankly, we're primarily focused in the US. Other than that, I don't know. I mean, I guess we'd have to look at what they're trying to do. Things like in California, et cetera, you know, ration water to villages, et cetera. But
Well, let me
I don't really have a good answer for you.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, CCL Munya is very focused on action on climate change to reduce CO2 emissions. That's our number one focus right now. If we can achieve legislation that addresses climate change by reducing CO2 emissions, we'll begin to focus on other things. Right now, we're trying to get the United States on board to address climate change. Right now, among developing, I think there's 21 developed economies in the world. The United States and Australia are the only two of those developed economies that have not put a price on carbon. And so that's our focus. And we are, of course, historically, we are the largest emitter of CO2 in the world. Everybody likes to point to China, but it turns out historically, if you integrate up all the emissions, we are far ahead of China. They are truly the instantaneous emitter, number one emitter in the world right now. But it turns out historically, we're way ahead of them in terms of integrated CO2 emissions. So hopefully that answers your question.
Great presentation. Definitely climate change is a major issue, and the power generation sector is one of the places where we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And you talked a lot about, you know, a carbon tax on a federal level, and that's
carbon fee.
A carbon fee. Okay, excuse me. And that's something that's been in talks, as I'm aware. What do you think? You know, I think there are current proposals also that are targeting some credits, zero emission credits for renewable generation that might not have the price upside impacts on consumers as a carbon fee might impose. What do you think of that type of policy instead of a carbon fee? And, you know, would it be more beneficial in terms of reducing and in greenhouse gas emission, incentivizing renewable build out in the US?
Well, let me say, first of all, we're very much in favor of things like that. We think things like that potentially could be complementary, but we think the fastest and most impactful way to address CO2 emissions is to put a fee on fossil fuels. The nice thing about putting a fee on fossil fuels, it impacts 80% of the emitters in this country. Okay, it impacts not just, you know, the power generation sector, but it'll affect automotive sector as well. And right now, the automotive sector is the largest single emitter of CO2 in this country because we have a lot of cars. It's a big nation, right? So they actually exceeded the power generation emission a couple of years ago. So we very much in favor of things that could be complementary to putting a fee on carbon. And the reason we say fee, by the way, is because if the government doesn't keep the money, it's not a tax, right? So I think it's important to people understand that they're not being taxed. This is a fee, and they're going to see money back from this. So anyway, hopefully I answered your question.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
I wish we had time for more during our program, but we don't. I need to turn it back over to President Bill to close us out.
All right, well, Cliff and Jeff, thank you so much. And it's great to see Rotarians so involved in what is perhaps the greatest challenge of our times, climate change, which It's affecting the future of all of us, and especially our children. Our club has a tradition, speaking of things environmental, of planting trees. We have Trees to the Capitol. Our current chair is Brian Ingram. I did it for about 10 years. And we plant a tree in the honor of our speakers each week. So you'll be receiving in the mail a certificate